But with no man to hold on to, how do you propose to stay on the horse?
As you do, Your Grace. With my thighs.
Everyone thinks medieval women were submissive housewives, but here's what's terrifying. They had more economic power than most women today. They controlled money, made business decisions, and their husbands legally couldn't stop them. What medieval law gave wives this authority that we somehow lost? When most people think about medieval women, they conjure up images of quiet housewives baking bread while their husbands went off to work. The perfect tradwife fantasy, right? Well, that picture is about as accurate as thinking medieval knights spent their days rescuing damsels in distress. The whole traditional wife idea that gets thrown around today, it didn't come from the Middle Ages at all. That cozy domestic dream actually comes straight from 1950s America, when families could afford to have one parent stay home. Medieval families couldn't afford such luxuries. Survival meant everyone worked, and worked hard. Real medieval women were anything but delicate flowers waiting at home. They were out in the fields during harvest season, swinging sickles and hauling grain. They ran businesses, managed estates, and made decisions that kept entire households alive. The romantic notion of women being protected from the harsh realities of medieval life? Complete nonsense. Let's not forget that medieval society operated on a completely different economic system. Most families lived paycheck to paycheck, except there were no paychecks. There was just constant work to avoid starvation. When your family's survival depends on every pair of hands contributing, gender roles become much more flexible than our stereotypes suggest. Upper-class women had it different, but not necessarily easier. They managed vast estates with dozens of servants, oversaw complex financial arrangements, and made decisions that affected hundreds of people. These weren't women sitting around embroidering all day. They were essentially running medieval corporations. And the weird part is how this myth persists despite mountains of historical evidence. Medieval records show women buying and selling property, running businesses, appearing in court, and wielding significant economic power. Yet somehow we've convinced ourselves they were all sitting quietly by the fire, waiting for their husbands to make every decision. The truth is messier and far more interesting. Medieval women fought for their rights, negotiated their marriages, and carved out spaces of power wherever they could find them. They weren't victims of their time period any more than women today are victims of ours. They were people trying to make the best lives possible within their circumstances. Then there's the practical reality that medieval life was brutal for everyone. Plagues, wars, famines, and high mortality rates meant that traditional gender roles often became irrelevant overnight. When your husband died in battle or from disease, you didn't have the luxury of remaining a helpless housewife. You adapted or you died. The medieval world was shaped by survival, not by some idealized version of domestic harmony. Women did whatever was necessary to keep their families alive and their communities functioning. That meant getting their hands dirty in ways that would make modern tradwife enthusiasts run screaming. But what exactly did this medieval women's work look like in practice? The reality might surprise anyone who thinks manual labor was just for men. Medieval women didn't just sit by the fireplace embroidering while their husbands did all the work. That's fantasy. These women rolled up their sleeves and got their hands dirty because survival demanded it. Harvest time meant everyone worked. Women grabbed sickles and scythes right alongside men, cutting grain from dawn until their backs screamed. The crops wouldn't wait for gender roles to sort themselves out. Families that didn't harvest together often went hungry together. Women also handled the tedious but crucial job of gleaning, picking up every leftover grain from the fields after the main harvest. Waste meant starvation. In medieval towns, women ran businesses that kept communities fed and functioning. Alewives brewed and sold beer, which was safer to drink than most water. Bakers' wives often managed the family bakery while their husbands worked other trades. Some women ran their own shops entirely, selling everything from candles to cooked meat pies. These weren't side hustles or hobbies. They were serious businesses that paid rent and fed families. Then there's the textile trade, which basically belonged to women. Spinning thread wasn't just busy work, it was skilled labor that required years to master. Women could spin while walking, talking, or watching children. The phrase spinster originally just meant a woman who spun thread professionally, not someone who couldn't find a husband. Weaving was even more specialized, and female weavers could earn serious money selling cloth to merchants. But here's where it gets really interesting. Upper-class women weren't lounging around eating grapes either. They managed massive estates with dozens of workers. A noblewoman might oversee harvests, livestock, brewing, cooking, and trade negotiations, all while her husband was away fighting wars or handling politics. She was essentially running a complex business operation that could employ hundreds of people. And the weird part is how normal this all seemed back then. Work wasn't divided into men's jobs and women's jobs the way we imagine. If something needed doing and you could do it, you did it. Economic survival trumped everything else. A blacksmith's wife might help at the forge. A merchant's daughter might travel to markets and negotiate deals. A farmer's widow might take over the entire farm and make it more profitable than her husband ever did. The idea that medieval women just stayed home and obeyed orders falls apart when you look at what they actually did every day. These women were grinding grain, managing money, supervising workers, and making business decisions that affected their entire communities. What's fascinating is how much legal power some of these working women actually had. The laws around property ownership might surprise you even more than their work lives did. When we hear about medieval women and property, most people assume they had zero rights. Married women became invisible under the law, right? Well, that's only half the story. Medieval property laws were messier and more complex than our modern assumptions suggest. Single women could absolutely own land. They bought it, sold it, and inherited it just like men. Widows, even better off. Many regions gave widows automatic rights to 1/3 of their husband's property, sometimes called dower rights. That wasn't just a token gesture. We're talking about real estate, businesses, and cold hard cash that became theirs to control. But here's where things get interesting. Some areas actually gave women half their husband's wealth the moment they married. Not after he died, immediately. The wife could manage that portion, make decisions about it, and use the income however she wanted. Makes sense when you realize marriage was basically a business merger between families. Then there are the loopholes. Medieval people loved their legal workarounds, and clever women figured out ways to keep property even after marriage. Some families set up trusts or special arrangements before the wedding. Others used their connections to local courts or church officials who might interpret laws more favorably. Regional differences made everything even more complicated. What worked in one county might be completely illegal 50 miles away. English common law said one thing, but local customs often said another. Urban areas frequently gave women more freedom than rural villages. Merchant families played by different rules than farming communities. Widows hit the jackpot in terms of legal independence. They could remarry or stay single, their choice entirely. They could run businesses, sign contracts, and appear in court without needing any man's permission. Some became incredibly wealthy. Others used their newfound freedom to travel, invest in new ventures, or support causes they believed in. Property rights also depended heavily on social class. A nobleman's daughter had access to lawyers, influential relatives, and political connections that a peasant woman could never dream of. But even among the lower classes, women found ways to accumulate small plots of land, shops, or valuable goods that gave them some economic independence. The weirdest part? Sometimes being married actually hurt a woman's legal standing more than being single or widowed. Marriage meant her husband controlled most decisions, but death or divorce could restore her autonomy completely. Many widows chose never to remarry specifically because they didn't want to give up their legal rights again. Family negotiations played a huge role too. Parents who wanted to protect their daughters would work out detailed agreements about what happened to property during marriage. Brothers might promise to support their sisters if marriages went badly. Extended families created safety nets that formal laws didn't always provide. Understanding property rights reveals something crucial about medieval women's real power. But legal ownership was just one piece of the puzzle. How did women actually use these rights when conflicts arose? Medieval women showing up in court might sound impossible if you believe the whole silent and obedient story, but here's what actually happened. Women routinely appeared before judges, argued cases, and fought legal battles that would make modern lawyers sweat. Court records from across Europe tell a different tale than the one we've been sold. Women sued neighbors over stolen chickens, battled merchants who cheated them, and defended their right to inherited land. The weird part is how often they won these cases, even when facing off against men who supposedly held all the power. Legal standing wasn't simple, though. Marriage did change everything for women, but it didn't make them disappear from the legal world entirely. Married women faced more restrictions, sure, but clever ones found ways around the rules. Some had their husbands formally agree to let them handle business independently. Others used legal loopholes that varied wildly from place to place. Then there's the matter of female authority that nobody talks about. Plenty of medieval women weren't just defending themselves in court, they were the ones bringing cases against others. Widowed landowners regularly hauled tenants to court for unpaid rent or property damage. These weren't meek housewives hiding behind male relatives. They showed up ready to fight. Written contracts reveal another layer most people miss entirely. Women used official seals, signed documents, and negotiated complex business deals that required legal backup when things went wrong. A baker's wife in 14th century London could sue a grain supplier just as easily as her husband could. Makes sense when you realize survival often depended on these business relationships. But why did some women have more legal freedom than others? Location mattered hugely. German towns often gave women broader rights than French countryside areas. English common law differed from Italian city-state rules. Even within the same region, local customs could flip everything upside down. Single women and widows held the strongest legal positions by far. Without husbands to technically cover their legal identity, they operated almost like men in many court systems. Widows especially became legal powerhouses, controlling property, making contracts, and settling disputes with an authority that would shock anyone expecting medieval meekness. The most surprising part might be how these women used written evidence and legal procedures that seem remarkably modern. They kept receipts, demanded witnesses, and understood court processes well enough to navigate complex property disputes successfully. Female legal authority extended beyond personal disputes too. Women overseeing large estates dealt with tenant complaints, boundary disagreements, and contract violations as part of regular business. They weren't just managing households, they were running what amounted to small governments with real legal responsibilities. All this legal activity raises an interesting question about what medieval women were really up to when they weren't in court. Their involvement in marriage negotiations and personal choices might surprise you even more than their courtroom victories. Medieval marriage looked nothing like today's romantic comedies. Forget candlelit dinners and love letters. Most marriages were business transactions. Families negotiated like they were trading livestock because, honestly, that's pretty much what they were doing. Parents arranged matches based on land, money, and political connections. A blacksmith's daughter might marry a merchant's son to combine their trades. Noble families practically drew up contracts like corporate mergers. Love? Well, that was a nice bonus if it happened to show up later. But here's where it gets interesting. Some women actually had more say than you'd expect. Church law required both parties to consent to marriage. Sure, family pressure was intense, but technically, a woman could refuse. Some did, especially if the proposed husband seemed particularly awful or abusive. The church backed them up on this, at least in theory. Widows hit the medieval jackpot. Once their husbands died, many gained control over property, businesses, and their own romantic futures. They could choose their next husband or decide to stay single. Some widows became serial entrepreneurs, marrying strategically multiple times to build wealth and influence. Others said thanks, but no thanks to remarriage entirely. Then there's the fascinating world of remarriage politics. A wealthy widow with land became the medieval equivalent of a hot commodity. Suitors would line up, but she held the cards. She could pick someone young and attractive, someone rich and powerful, or someone who'd leave her alone to run her own affairs. Smart widows often chose door number 3. Sexual expectations were strictly regulated by the church, but reality was messier. Adultery happened. Divorce was nearly impossible, but annulments could be arranged if you had enough money and the right connections. Some couples lived separately for years. Others found creative ways around the rules. Marriage contracts sometimes included surprising details. Some women negotiated to keep certain property separate. Others secured promises about how they'd be treated or where they'd live. These weren't romantic vows, they were legal protections in a world where women needed all the security they could get. The weird part is that many medieval marriages probably worked better than expected. When survival depends on teamwork, couples learn to cooperate. Shared hardships and common goals created partnerships, even if they didn't start with passionate love. Young women faced the biggest restrictions, caught between family expectations and limited choices. But even they sometimes found ways to influence their fate through clever negotiations or strategic delays. What's really striking is how much individual circumstances mattered. A merchant's widow in London had vastly different options than a peasant's daughter in rural France. Status, location, and family wealth shaped every woman's marriage prospects. Speaking of status and wealth, these same factors determined something else entirely: how medieval women expressed themselves through the clothes they wore and the image they projected to the world. When most people think of medieval women with real power, they picture queens maybe, or the occasional warrior lady with a sword. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of the most influential women weren't wielding weapons at all. They were running massive religious operations that would make modern CEOs jealous. Take abbesses, for instance. These weren't quiet nuns praying in corners. An abbess controlled entire convents, managed thousands of acres of farmland, collected rents from dozens of tenants, and made decisions that affected entire regions. The abbess of Fontevraud ruled over not just nuns, but monks too. Imagine telling a bunch of medieval men what to do and actually having them listen. Makes sense, right? Then there's the political game that noble women played with frightening skill. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just marry two kings. She outlived one, divorced another, and spent decades pulling strings across Europe. When her sons rebelled against their father, guess who was orchestrating things behind the scenes? Eleanor ended up imprisoned for it, but that's beside the point. Her influence stretched from England to the Holy Land. But why focus only on the famous ones? Lesser-known noble women were cutting deals, arranging marriages that shifted entire kingdoms, and negotiating treaties that prevented wars. This wasn't accidental. It was calculated power politics disguised as family planning. Religious life offered something revolutionary for its time: education. Convents became centers of learning where women could read, write, manage accounts, and study everything from medicine to philosophy. Hildegard of Bingen wrote music, developed medical treatments, and corresponded with emperors, all while technically being a humble nun. And the weird part is how soft power actually worked back then. A well-connected woman could whisper the right words at dinner and change the course of a military campaign. She could arrange a strategic marriage and unite two feuding territories without a single sword being drawn. Sometimes preventing a war required more skill than fighting one. Even queens who never held official titles exercised serious influence. They controlled access to the king, managed royal finances, and served as regents when their husbands were off crusading or died inconveniently early. Queen mothers were particularly dangerous. They'd already survived court politics once and weren't about to let some young upstart ruin their family's prospects. Let's not forget that medieval people took religious authority seriously. When an abbess spoke, people listened. Not because she was charming, but because she represented divine will. That gave certain women a public platform that would have been impossible in purely secular roles. The most successful medieval women understood something crucial. Real power often worked best when it didn't look like power at all. They influenced, negotiated, and commanded through networks that stretched across continents, proving that authority came in many forms. But power was just one way medieval women expressed themselves. Their daily choices about appearance and dress told equally fascinating stories about identity and status. Think your medieval ancestors walked around in boring brown sacks? Think again. Medieval women took their fashion seriously, and clothing wasn't just about staying warm. It was a walking advertisement of who you were, what you owned, and where you stood in society's pecking order. A merchant's wife might sport a vibrant blue wool dress with silver buttons, while her servant wore undyed linen. The difference wasn't subtle. Colors like deep red, purple, and bright blue cost serious money because the dyes came from exotic places. Wearing them screamed, "I can afford this." Well, assuming anyone was actually screaming about their outfit choices, but here's where things get interesting. Authorities got nervous about all this fashion competition. Sumptuary laws popped up across Europe, basically dress codes written by paranoid rulers who couldn't handle seeing a baker's daughter looking fancier than a baron's wife. These laws dictated everything from fabric types to sleeve lengths. In some places, only nobles could wear ermine fur or gold thread. Commoners caught wearing silk-faced hefty fines. Did people follow these rules? Not really. Records show constant violations and creative workarounds. Women found ways to show off their wealth while technically staying within the law. Can't wear silk? Fine, they'd choose expensive wool in eye-catching patterns. Forbidden from gold jewelry? Silver would have to do, but they'd wear lots of it. Then there's the beauty game medieval women played with surprising sophistication. They plucked their hairlines to create high foreheads, the beauty standard of the time. Pale skin meant you didn't work outdoors like a peasant, so women used white lead powder and other questionable substances on their faces. Some of these cosmetics were literally poisonous, but vanity apparently trumped safety concerns. Jewelry served multiple purposes beyond looking pretty. A woman's collection represented portable wealth she could control, even when married. Rings, brooches, and necklaces could be sold during hard times or passed down to daughters. Smart women built impressive collections as their personal insurance policy. Regional differences made fashion even more complex. Italian women embraced different styles than their French counterparts. Trade routes brought new influences: Byzantine silk, Islamic geometric patterns, or Flemish lace techniques. Fashion trends spread surprisingly quickly through medieval Europe, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and traveling nobles. The wealthy didn't just buy expensive clothes, they invented new ways to show off. Elaborate headdresses, trailing sleeves, and intricate embroidery required skilled craftspeople and serious time investment. These weren't practical choices for working women, which was exactly the point. Even working women found ways to express personal style within their limitations. A well-made woolen cloak, carefully maintained leather shoes, or a beautifully woven belt could elevate a simple outfit. Pride in appearance crossed all social boundaries. Medieval women understood something we sometimes forget: how you present yourself to the world matters, and clothing remains one of humanity's most enduring forms of self-expression and social communication.